Welcome to another episode of Medussa Muses. Please pardon my absence, but I had multiple life events that made it almost impossible to get this episode out. And even though it's no longer Black History Month, I'd like to get out all the topics I wanted to talk about. So, last episode, I talked about how representation is good for mental health and reparations are good for material conditions. This episode, I'm going to talk about Black culture, Black stereotypes, and Black liberation. But let's start with what is Black culture and why are white people so obsessed with it? Is there such thing as cultural appropriation? Why can't everyone just appreciate Black culture? Well, I hope you have a mug of something good and are in a cozy place because this is going to be uncomfortable for some of you. This podcast is made possible by my patrons on patreon.com/MedussaMuse. If you would like to support the podcast, follow the link below to become a monthly subscriber where you get access to my exclusive Discord server as well as early access to podcast episodes a week before they go live. Let's start this conversation off with a disclaimer and a definition. First, Black culture is not a monolith. The definition I'm giving is deliberately broad because and like any culture, there's people within the culture that will not embrace or experience or even celebrate the same aspects of the culture. Also, as a Black person, I am an authority on Black culture, but not the authority. However, no white person should speak over me as a Black person or any Black person who is discussing their cultural experiences even if it conflicts with the experiences of other Black people. This is an issue to be discussed within the Black community, and as someone on the outside, just take all the experiences for what they are and just mind your business. With that out of the way, let's explain some more stuff. Black culture is the lived history and experiences of descendants of African slaves. The culture itself is varied because the African slave trade took our ancestors to many places like the United States, the United Kingdom, Central America, and South America. A Black person from Brazil will have a different cultural experience than a Black person from the United States, though both would share slave ancestors. But as I've learned recently, most Americans living in white segregated parts of the US are completely unaware of Black people existing outside of the US and Africa. Their perceptions of Black culture are formed wholly through our portrayals in media, which is why it's so often I can encounter white people who think that Black culture is rap music, saggy pants, single mother households, and ghettos. Why? Because that's all these people can see of us outside their suburbs and gated communities. They watch movies and TV shows with Black gangsters and strong Black women struggling to keep their children off the streets. They see movies where Black women are either the help or sexual objects, while men are reduced to thugs and sexual predators. Despite Black music existing in every genre, essentially being the progenitor of all American music, only rap is associated with this monolithic straw man of our culture, and only the rap that's about flexing wealth and demonstrating sexual prowess, and the nihilistic partier. Not to mention that these individuals think that Black fashion is apple-bottom jeans, boots with the fur, and gold chains. This is not our culture, but parts born from the restrictions put upon us by the ruling, white supremacist class. System. Rap is more than just flexing. It's poetry that we've used to express lived experiences and our observations of the society we live in. We also have jazz, blues, R&B, rock, disco, techno, and a lot more music that our ancestors have influenced. Our fashion is colorful and more than just the westernized fashions popularized by the mainstream. There's new African fashions, which marry some of African styles and fabrics with designs from, well, the West. Not to mention the fabulous hairstyles for our natural hair, not just weaves. We come from a long history of radical activists, eloquent writers, curious inventors, and respectable professionals. We are descendants of enslaved people who did more than just get beaten to death. These individuals carried this country on their backs and were integral to its birth and life. Even today, Black bodies continue to be used as slave labor under the prison industrial complex. But that's just Black culture in the US. I recently watched a video where a Black Brazilian man was talking about the rich culture in Brazil and how the history of how slaves with certain skill sets were sent to different places based on the need of those skills. Though Black people in the US struggle to hold on to our culture, history, and identities as Black people, it's nice to hear that other Black people have successfully retained some culture and are faring better at combating culture vultures. In fact, it gives us something to sort of look at and maybe look at their homework and see if we can maybe copy it and, get some of our culture back. Which brings me to cultural appropriation. There's a lot of misconceptions surrounding cultural appropriation. Many people think that this term is just a way of limiting people's liberties and bullying white people. The truth is, some people do use the term to bully white people. It's usually white people who don't understand what cultural appropriation is. But who can blame them, since the word has been used to the point it seems there's no real meaning for it. But the word does have meaning, and it's one that more people need to acquaint themselves with. Cultural appropriation occurs when the ruling hegemony wears the culture of a marginalized people or community as a costume or for fashion. This means that whatever this culture wears, eats, or celebrates is looked down upon for these people, but is considered trendy for the dominant culture. For Black people, this is how white people with dreads are considered edgy or fashionable, but Black people with dreads are thought of as unclean, sloppy, and unprofessional. Cultural appropriation is more of a systematic issue rather than an individual one, but that doesn't mean that it's still not harmful and offensive on an individual level. After all, not all Black people necessarily care, but that doesn't mean it's not harmful or offensive. That's why you'll find Black people who don't care about white people wearing dreads, speaking Black English, or even saying the N-word. Just know that if you're white and you choose to do these things in the presence of a Black person, that person will react however they react, and be ready to accept the consequences of your actions. After all, if you're a fellow American, it should be abundantly clear that that freedom of speech means that the government can't censor you. But if another citizen decides that they want to react to your speech, they're well within their rights to shout you down or expel you from their spaces. That's the beauty of freedom. But back to cultural appropriation. There's no such thing as appropriating the dominant culture, as cultural appropriation only refers to the unfair power structure that occurs when people from a dominant culture systematically or individually adopts parts of a marginalized culture and incorporate it into its own while still condemning that culture's origin and, well, the people belonging to it. Therefore, it's considered favorable for marginalized people to adopt dominant cultural practices and costumes. That means that when you see a Black woman wearing straightened hair or wigs, they are not participating in cultural appropriation. Instead, they are victims of cultural homogenization, which is a form of cultural genocide. That's why it's particularly important for self-proclaimed allies to listen to Black voices who speak up against cultural appropriation, and to listen to them. It's also important not to police Black people who aren't as guarded about their own culture. It's not your place to belittle them for not knowing more about their culture. It's a feature of living under a system that has commodified us and continues to alienate us from our culture and destroy it.
Pardon me, but you look like you wanted to say something. It's my show, but would you like to be a part of it? If you're not listening to this on Anchor, head over to anchor.fm/Medussa-musing. Once you're there, leave me a message after you finish the episode. There's a button with the word on it to make it super easy. And who knows? Maybe I'll address your message on the show.
A lot of white people don't understand the concept of in-house keeping. There are a lot of ways to rein in allies and hold them accountable without throwing them into the maws of a social media frenzy. In other words, sometimes you need to call someone out to protect the people in our spaces. But other times, you simply need to call people in so everything can be resolved without hurting everyone involved. But not enough people are able to differentiate between infighting that needs to be kept in-house and manipulative or abusive behavior that needs to be dragged out of the house. This often results in so-called allies who repeatedly disrespect Black, Indigenous, and people of color and undo the work done by them being kept in these spaces, while the Black, Indigenous, people of color who did the work of making these spaces safe and revolutionary are pushed out. It's a giant problem, and the reason why we must stop letting any person claiming to be revolutionary take the lead in our revolutions, especially fair-skinned allies who have yet to purge themselves of white supremacy and do not keep themselves vigilant of how it reasserts itself over them. Why? Because white supremacy was designed to bring fair-skinned and white people comfort with the oppressions of capitalism. It's the activation command that adjusts their discomfort levels to be more manageable. After all, they can still complain about being poor and living under an unfair hierarchy while also celebrating the fact that they ain't Black. That's why we can't be rallying around people who can fall prey to this siren song. We, Black, Indigenous, people of color, need total revolution, freedom from bigotry, classism, religious suppression, and genocide. We understand that white people are mainly satisfied with financial appeasement and call things a day, leaving the rest of us to fend for ourselves. That's why I want to speak praises about Black femmes right now. To all the queer, poor, disabled, and hurt femmes, I see you. Take care of yourself, because we are the mules of the world who will carry the burden of the revolution. You see, intersectionality was a term created by a Black woman to describe specifically how Black women are affected by misogyny and racism at the same time, because the intersection of their identity is their race as a Black person and their gender as a woman. This term refers to the observation of the various intersections of identities and how people who have multiple marginalized identities will suffer similar oppressions to those who possess similar intersections with that identity. That means that poor Black people and poor white people in America can relate on the basis of class oppression and even organize on that basis. But it would be easy to alienate the white people by focusing on Black issues because they have no interest or obligation to help Black people outside of their class identity. In fact, it's been shown time and time again that white people will abandon Black comrades in the face of a deal that gives themselves a little more than the Black person will get. It's an effective tactic for busting up revolutionary orgs and keeping the working class from organizing against capitalists. This is why it's important that organizing groups center around marginalized voices and their needs. They should also learn more about house cleaning and dealing with bad actors and opportunists. And above all, we need to learn about gatekeeping. I know, the dirty word that we all talk about like it's so bad, but it's not. It's a tool like any other that sits in the toolbox. People often abuse this tool for silly stuff like barring someone from being in a fandom for not being knowledgeable enough or like hardcore enough, but it's an effective tool for keeping bad actors and abusive people outside the gates where they can't hurt the people in our spaces. For Black people, we gatekeep our culture. Many of us are trying to reclaim it from the white people who have stolen it and made it trendy for the rest of the nation to do with as they please. It may be uncomfortable, but that's necessary. Change is uncomfortable and alien, but necessary if we're ever going to move towards justice and equality. For too many years, we've had no real control over the national narrative that's been set for us by white supremacist governing structure. It's about time that we change that, so I encourage you, dear listener, go look up Black history. Find more Black voices to listen to. Don't speak over them, but listen to their experiences. Think about your words and the effects of those words in some social situations. Remember that if you personally slip up and do something that slips into cultural appropriation, it's not the end of the world. Learn from the slip up, make some changes, and move on, ready to teach people like you who make similar slip ups. Well, that's all I have to say this time. Thank you for listening. Stay cozy.